Buenos días, bienvenidos a esta conferencia que tenemos hoy sobre tratamiento de las habilidades auditivas en niños con pérdida. A ver, perdón, a ver si ahora. Bien, y simplemente pues quería agradecerles su presencia, dar la bienvenida a todas aquellas personas que no son de nuestra facultad, a la misma, agradecerles que estén aquí y que espero que disfruten del acto. Quería agradecer muy especialmente, por supuesto, a la doctora Madell, que nos acompaña y que es la persona que dará la conferencia, pero voy a dejar la presentación para Carmen Abascal, a la que quería agradecer su presencia y también en la organización de esta conferencia, que realmente se debe a la Fundación Oír es Clave y a.g.bell, que la han propuesto, la subvencionan y la promocionan. Nosotros estamos siempre encantados de trabajar con ellos y es un placer que haya otras instituciones que simplemente pues nos prestan todos sus recursos para poder organizar estos actos. Y quería también pues dar las gracias a Svante Borgesson, que está allí sentado, de la Fundación Oír es Clave, que también colabora. Y sin más, pues voy a dar la palabra a Carmen Abascal para que haga la presentación.
Buenas tardes. Buenas tardes a todos. Muchas gracias por estar aquí a una hora de mediodía. Especial agradecimiento a la Complutense a la Universidad Complutense y a esta facultad, porque siempre nos han abierto las puertas para dar a conocer la sordera y la implicación que tiene tanto en las familias como en los niños. Quiero presentar, es un honor para nosotros contar con la presencia de la doctora Madell. Ella es audióloga pediátrica, es terapeuta audioverbal certificada. Además, es miembro de la a.g.bell Academia y ha publicado muchísimos artículos, libros, tiene unos vídeos estupendos, un blog magnífico y creo que es un placer tenerla aquí y escucharla porque vamos a aprender todos muchísimo. También en su nombre les transmito que pueden hacer preguntas cuando lo deseen. Por favor, levanten la mano para que les pasen el micrófono para que puedan hacer la traducción. De nuevo, muchas gracias y doctora Madell puede empezar cuando lo desee.
Thank you to the university and to Clave and a.g.bell International and to Carmen and Cervante who have invited me here. I am delighted to be here. I apologize for not being able to speak Spanish, but I hope you will forgive me. I would like to understand who is in the audience. So how many of you are audiology students? How many of you are speech-language pathology students? How many? There's a lot of people did not raise their hands. How many of you are teachers? Oh, a lot of teachers, good. Parents of children with hearing loss. Welcome, especially to the parents. What have I left out? What have I forgotten? Professionals? Oh. How many of you are audiologists? Speech-language pathologists? Teachers of children with hearing loss, psychologists, school administrators. Now, did I leave anything out? Okay. I think we are a small enough group that we can do this in an informal way. So if you have a question, please raise your hand and somebody from Clave will bring you a microphone, because first of all, we want it for the translation, and second, for anybody in the audience who does not hear well, we want to be sure that everything is amplified. If the questions end up being too long, we'll hold the questions until the end, but let's try to see where we are. Okay, so the topic for today is managing children with hearing loss. This is a topic that I really need a whole week to talk about, but I'm going to see what we can do in 2 hours. Okay, let's start off with what I think is sort of the basis for the way I think about audiology. I have a lot of hats. I'm a pediatric audiologist, I'm a speech-language pathologist, I'm an auditory verbal therapist, so I think about things in sort of a lot of ways, which has been helpful to me as a professional. I think it's critical that we understand from the beginning that hearing loss is a neurological emergency. We don't have time to think about hearing loss and about what can happen. We need to think about the fact that hearing loss is urgent and we need to deal with it quickly. Hearing loss is the most common disability worldwide. The most important thing we need to know about hearing loss for children is that the problem with hearing loss is that it affects auditory brain development. Because if sound doesn't get in, the auditory brain doesn't develop. And if it doesn't develop in the first few years, we don't get to develop it later. That's why it's an emergency. A child who's born with a hearing loss has already had 20 weeks of not hearing. A typical hearing child, when that child is born, they have already been listening for 20 weeks. They have heard their mother. They can tell the difference between the mother's voice and the father's voice. They can recognize inflection. They can recognize the rhythm of speech. They recognize when we say, when we raise our voices. Did you say that you wanted juice? When our voices go up, indicating a question, they recognize that. They don't know what it means, but they recognize the rhythm. They recognize the tone. They can tell which words are important by the way we stress them, and they can separate important words from the smaller words that are less important. The sounds that they hear when they're in the womb are certainly softer than the sounds they hear when they come out, when they're born, and they're also much more low frequency. They're more low pitch. But as we'll learn later, that may be a problem in the way we listen. So, but even though they're hearing softer and they're hearing primarily low pitch, their auditory brain is being stimulated. And when a child is born with hearing loss, they already have some auditory deprivation. So we need to move quickly so that we can develop the auditory brain. Children need to have their auditory brain developed by 3 to 3.5 years if they are going to maximally learn to use hearing. They need to have auditory access early. And they need to have auditory access for 2 important reasons. By having their auditory brain developed, they develop literacy, develop language, and they also develop literacy. By literacy, I mean that they are able to learn to read the words, to sound out the words in front of them. They're able to learn to read them, and then they're able to get information from them and to learn about the world by having the skill to read. But literacy is a phonological activity. We learn literacy by having access to sound information. So a child needs to recognize that the ta-ta-ta-ta-ta sound looks like this. They need to recognize what that means so that they understand what they're learning and what they're hearing. They need to make the sound symbol association if they're going to learn to read, which is why it's critical that they have an auditory brain. Because if they don't get to make the sound symbol association. And that is why children who use sign language as their primary input don't develop good reading skills. The average in the United States, the average reading level of children who graduate from high schools for deaf children in which they use sign language is 3rd to 4th grade. In this culture, that makes them illiterate. It severely limits their choice of work. And that's not something we want for the children with hearing loss that we care about. So normal hearing children who are not exposed to spoken language, they may have normal hearing, but live in an environment in which no one is talking to them. Those children will also have a problem with auditory brain development, and that is something we would like to avoid. So we want all children to have as much language exposure as they possibly can if we're going to build their auditory brain. So let's talk about developing the auditory brain and using listening to learn. At birth, a child's brain has about 100 billion neurons, but they don't have synapses. They don't have the connections between the neurons. That they don't get until the brain is stimulated. So every time we talk to a child, we sing to a child, we read to a child, we tickle a child, we dance with a child, we're building their auditory brain. And that's what our goal is. Our goal is to build a child's auditory brain because that's the way they are going to learn to listen. So they have the opportunity to have multiple synapses, but we want to stimulate them so we can build the connections. As children grow, as they get older, the brain starts pruning away the synapses that are not used, and therein lies the problem. If we don't provide auditory stimulation early, then the synapses stop developing, and the auditory brain starts to shrink because it's not being used. And the visual cortex, which surrounds the auditory cortex, will start to grow because that's what's being used. So what does that mean for a child with a hearing loss? If we don't build the auditory brain early, by the time a child is 3 or 4 or 5, their auditory brain has started to shrink and they don't get the opportunity later to build that skill. So that's something we want to try to avoid. Adult brains have about 300 trillion links, and children have a quadrillion connections. And we want to be sure that we get to use them. This has critical implication for hearing loss. What we need to understand is that very early on, we need to provide children with auditory access so that they can hear well enough to use listening for language and literacy. And if we can do that, then children with hearing loss have the opportunity to be anything they want to be. I like this slide because I like the fact that here that we can see that as mom is or parent, whoever this is talking to the child, we are just growing the auditory brain. We're building the connections for the child. And I like the idea of the flowers coming out of this child's head as the child learns. So let's talk a minute about hearing. Hearing is a first-order event for the development of spoken language and literacy skills. If you do not hear, it is very, very hard to learn spoken language and to develop the phonologic skills that are necessary to start with literacy. Anytime you hear the word hearing, you really need to think auditory brain development, because that is what happens when children hear. Acoustic, and they need to not just hear, but they need to hear clear speech. if they listen to speech that sounds like this, they're going to have a very hard time learning. Now, you are an adult. You already have language. You may be able to figure out what I'm saying by hearing the parts of what I say when I'm talking about muffled speech. But if you're a little person and you're trying to learn language for the first time, you can't do that. So not only do they have to be able to hear it, but they have to have clear speech in order to hear it. It has to be intelligible, and that's important. Now, we have eyelids, and we can close our eyes and cut off vision, but we don't have earlids. Children and adults hear 24 hours a day if you have normal hearing. If you are a hearing impaired child, you only have access to the world when you're wearing your technology. And then only if your technology is doing what it needs to do and providing excellent hearing. And we're going to talk about that during this talk. We also want to be sure that the speech that they're hearing is louder than the background noise around them. Children have a much harder time hearing in noise than adults do. And we want to be sure that children are hearing well enough so that they can understand speech. Children need to hear about 10 times loud. The speech needs to be about 10 times louder than the noise for them to get a really clear signal. If speech and noise are close together, children are not going to get a clear signal, which means that they're not getting enough auditory access and they're going to be missing a lot that they need to learn. So our early intervention programs, our classrooms, our homes need to be able to provide what children need to learn. They need to be quiet. There needs to be reduced background noise, and somebody needs to be talking to them all day long. So hearing loss is a doorway problem. The problem with hearing loss is we're blocking the entry of sound to the brain. That's what hearing loss does. So what do we do to solve this problem? Well, I have been in this field for 50 years. And what I can do now is a lot different than what I could do when I started in this field. When I started in this field, hearing aids were okay, but not if you had a severe hearing loss. And we didn't have cochlear implants, and we didn't have FM systems, and so access was a bigger problem. No longer. Hearing aids, cochlear implants, bone-anchored systems, remote microphone systems like FMs are available now, and there is no child who we cannot make hear. And that's what we have to do. We have to be sure that we are providing auditory information to build the neural pathways so that every child with hearing loss has auditory access. And that, it sounds easier than it is. In order for that to work, a child has to have not just put a hearing aid on. You put glasses on, okay, my vision's better. But when you put a hearing aid on, I need to know not just that it's loud, but that it's clear and that it's sufficiently loud and that I'm hearing every speech sound. Because there are, 40-something phonemes that a kid needs to hear if we expect them to learn language. So the reason we have technology is just to get through the doorway. And that's our goal, to get through the doorway and build the auditory brain. And here's a whole bunch of sound getting in and getting there into the auditory brain through technology, which is its purpose. So let's talk a little bit about hearing versus listening versus understanding. The first thing that has to happen is sound has to get in and we have to be able to hear it. It has to reach the brain. And I keep pointing to this side of my head because language is a left brain activity. Right ear, left brain. I need to be sure that the sound especially gets through the right ear so it stimulates the left brain where language is. Right brain is music, left brain is language. You need both in order to have a wonderful life, but you better have language because otherwise the music part is a little limited. So hearing is providing acoustic access to the brain, and that's where I want it to be. We want to manage the environment and manage the technology so a child is hearing, so they're reaching the brain. So that's the sound is getting in. Then we need to have a child listen. Listen means is active participation. It's not just that the sound gets there. They have to tune in, and they have to be interested, and they have to pay attention. They have to be listening to what you're saying, whether or not they understand it. And that's why when we talk to children, we talk in sing-song voices. I'm going to make a bottle. Would you like a bottle now? Is the bottle going to be warm? You want a warm bottle or a cold bottle? Let's see, what should we do? So we talk to children in a way that gets their attention so that they are not only hearing but listening. And once they are listening, then with all the repetition that we have with children, we get to understanding. But if you don't have hearing, you don't get to listening, and then you don't get to understanding. So you need to have that sequence. And I can't say strongly enough how important it is that we get to the hearing. So we hear with the brain, and the ears are a doorway in, as we have said. Human beings have rich auditory brain access, and they have lots of brain tissue. But children are not little adults. They don't hear the same way that adults hear. Adults hear at about 200 words a minute. Children understand at about 124 words a minute. So we talk to children in a softer voice, in a slower voice, because that will enable them to pay more attention. That will enable them to get the language. So the higher centers of the brain are not fully developed for children. So we need to continue to build them. And we build that by providing a lot of stimulation and providing it at a rate in which they can take it. So children also don't have the amount of language that adults have. So they can't do auditory closure. By that I mean they can't fill in the blanks. So if I say to you, I need to make supper tonight, so I'm going to and I'm going to buy chicken and fish and salad. You know where I went. You don't need to know the word to know that I went to a grocery store, or exactly what store you don't know, but you get the idea because the word is missing. Or I'm going to the library because I need to borrow a... Right, so you know that because you have the language, you have the top-down information, and you can fill in the blanks. Children don't have that. They have to learn the language in order to be able to do that. So all children need a quieter environment so that they can get enough language, so that they can get more input, and they can learn better, and they can fill in the missing information. So children need they need a louder signal, they need a clear signal, and they need a quieter environment if they're going to learn well. So let's talk about redundancy a little bit, because that's how we learn. Fortunately, language is very redundant. External redundancy refers to the amount of information that comes from outside. What you learn from the things around you, from the people who are talking to you, from the things you see, from the things you experience. Internal redundancy, or bottom up, is stuff that you get, information that comes in, like from hearing aids and cochlear implants, and from the language that it's exposed to you. So there's an inverse relationship between the two kinds of redundancy. Specifically, children don't have top-down capabilities. They don't have that because they don't have the language yet. So we need to build that language so that they can develop those skills and fill in the blanks when they don't get all the information, just like the rest of us do. We need to improve intelligibility of language so we can build the bottom-up skills, which are the skills that bring language in. So most adults, as I said before, speak a lot faster than children can learn. Adults speak about 200 words a minute. Children hear well at 124 words a minute. So we need to slow down. We need to pause. we need to use supersegmentals and enhance our language so that when we're talking to children, we're providing them what they need. And we know that if a person is using clear speech when they talk to a child, we can improve what the child understands by about 40%. That's an enormous amount. So we really do need to be a little careful about how we talk to children. We know that by using the right technology, by using devices that control signal-to-noise ratio, like FM systems, even for very little children, we can improve what they're able to hear and improve their auditory access. So here is a picture of the brain. It's not what you think of the ear. It's not what you think of when you think about the ear, but that's what I want you to think of when you think about the ear, because that's really the part of, that's what we really need to think about. This is the ear you're more familiar with, but it's not, it's really only, it's a pathway. The real ear is that one. That's the part that's important. So let's talk a little bit about what children need to hear. So children need to hear a lot of things. They need, what does a newborn need to hear? Do newborns need to hear things? Is it important that they hear? When do typical children start learning? At birth. And they've heard for 20 weeks beforehand, so they learn a lot. They know a lot. So newborns need to hear, yes, they need to hear, and they need to understand they need to start learning what's being said to them. Here's another factor that we need to worry about. What about a conductive hearing loss? A hearing loss caused by problems in the middle ear or in the outer ear. If a child has an ear infection, they may or may not have a conductive hearing loss. A child who has a conductive hearing loss from an ear infection, that can last as long as 6 weeks. So if you have a child who has 3 ear infections in a year, that means there are going to be 18 weeks in which this child is not hearing well. Is that a big deal? You better believe it. We have, 18 weeks in which a child is missing what's happening in school, 18 weeks in which a child is not understanding what's happening at the dinner table. So how much language are we talking about a child missing if we don't have good auditory access? If a conductive hearing loss is not a minor problem, it's still a hearing loss and it still needs to be addressed. What about a mild hearing loss? I'm having a contest to find a new word to describe mild hearing loss. The problem with the word mild is if you say to a parent or to a classroom teacher that a child has a mild hearing loss, it sounds like it's not a big deal, but it is a big deal. A mild hearing loss, a child with a mild hearing loss will still miss 30 to 40% of what's said if they're more than 2 to 3 feet away from the person talking. What does that mean about language learning? What does that mean about developing the auditory brain? The fact that the thresholds are less than normal doesn't mean that it's not a serious issue, and it is, and it's one we need to understand. So what do children need to hear? They need to hear normal conversation. They need to hear when you're sitting and talking to them a few feet away, when you're at the dinner table, when you're riding in the car, whatever. But they also need to hear soft speech. 80 to 90% of what children learn, they learn by overhearing. They learn by hearing conversation that is not directed at them. If I am sitting and talking to you this far away, that's great. But when mommy is in the kitchen making dinner and the baby is sitting on the kitchen table in an infant seat, that baby is 5 or 6 feet away. And mommy may be talking about what she's doing, but if that baby can't hear it, then they have significant learning problems. There's significant language delay. So we really need to think about what it means when a child is not hearing soft speech. In a classroom, if a child doesn't hear soft speech, they are not going to hear the comments of other students. Now, if the teacher asks a question and a student answers, and the hearing impaired child gets that kind of a message, does it matter that the hearing impaired child can't hear what the answer to the question was? Even if the answer is wrong, it's information. It helps you think about something. Even if the answer is wrong, it's part of learning. So not hearing soft speech, first of all, in the early years, it's 80 to 90% of incidental learning that a child will be missing. And once the child gets to school, all of those kinds of conversations. The child won't hear in the cafeteria, they won't hear on the playground. So if you don't hear soft speech, you are missing a lot. So how much do they need to hear? They need to hear a lot. So we know that hearing loss and deafness cause very big changes to the auditory brain if the auditory brain is not stimulated using technology. Technology is critical and it's possible to fix. The auditory cortex is critical for developing speech perception, but only if it's stimulated. If it is not stimulated, if it doesn't hear speech, it will not develop language. So normal maturation of the auditory cortex is very critical, and it's a precondition to both language and literacy skills for phonologic awareness. Both of those things are critical, and there's a lot of research data that shows it. So what kinds of things affect brain access? Hearing loss, obviously, because the signal's not getting there. Fluctuating hearing, like what happens when a child has an ear infection and middle ear disease. If some days you hear at one level and other days you hear at another level, and the next day you hear it somewhere in the middle, how are you going to learn? If you don't have consistent access to sound, you're going to have a lot of difficulty learning. Reduced speech perception. You may hear the sound, it may be loud enough, but it may sound like this and you don't have a clear signal. A child who's got an auditory processing disorder or auditory neuropathy spectrum disorder are going to have a difficult time following conversation. They're going to have a difficult time learning because even though they hear it, it's not clear. Situations in which children are in a lot of competing noise and don't have access to clear understandable speech is going to reduce their auditory function. And children who have auditory attention disorders, children who have disorders where they can't tune in to auditory information. They can play with toys, they can do visual activities for long periods of time, but they can't attend to auditory information. Those children are going to have a problem. And all of those things are things that affect brain access. So what is the impact of this auditory deprivation? For children, they will have delays in language. They will have delays in literacy. They'll have delays learning to read. And if they have delays learning to read, they'll have delays getting information from literature, from reading. And they will have delays in social emotional skills. Why will this result in delays in social emotional skills? Because social emotional skills are language-based. If you are preschool years, you can get away with playing games without having all the language because the games don't require that much language. By the time you get to second grade, there's a whole lot of discussion about language. The games require following directions, they require turn taking, they require things that require a lot of language. And if a child doesn't have the language or can't follow it because the situation is noisy, that child is going to have trouble managing. And so social emotional skills are really related to language. We need to think about them as a language-based skill because if we build the language skills, the social emotional skills will usually follow. For adults, we have research which shows, in the olden days when I started in this field, we usually put hearing aids on one ear. So, I mean, you had a hearing aid on your right ear, and then, amazingly enough, the speech perception in your left ear started to deteriorate. Why? Because it wasn't getting stimulated. And we have a lot of data about that now. We no longer provide hearing aids to one ear. We now routinely fit hearing aids on both ears, and for that reason alone. We know from animal research and from some other research that there are neural changes in the brain for severe and profound hearing loss when there's no auditory stimulation. We know that by fitting technology appropriately early enough, we can reduce the changes in the brain just because we provide the auditory stimulation. There are structural changes that have been shown in animal models and some in humans. Some of the work of Anu Sharma has shown by using cortical evoked potentials that children who get technology fit early have normal auditory potentials. Children whose technology is fit children who are fit by a year have typical cortical responses. Children who are fit by 18 months are already one standard deviation below the norm. So fitting children early, we know affects brain function. This is a study that I think is very important. I'm very fond of this study. Hart and Risley were linguists in Kansas City and at the university, and they were studying linguistic development of infants. And what they did was they looked at children. The births were announced in the newspapers in Kansas City. So they contacted all the families whose babies were born in one calendar year and asked if they could come into their home and record the baby's vocalizations once a month for the first 3 years. And while they were there, they coincidentally recorded what was being said to the babies. So they not only had the baby's vocalizations, but they had the input to the babies at the same time. And what they discovered was that should be no surprise, but it's always nice to have data, that the more input a child had, the more output. So babies who heard about 30,000 words in a 14-hour day at the age of 3 had an IQ of 117 and a vocabulary of over 1,000 words. Babies who heard about 17,000 words in a 14-hour day had an IQ of 107 and a vocabulary of 750 words. Babies who heard about 8,600 words had an IQ of 79 and a vocabulary of 525. Those are startling data. And they're very critical when we think about children with hearing loss. Because what that says to us is we need to be sure, I feel like I missed a slide. Okay, we need to be sure that children with hearing loss have as much auditory stimulation as we can provide to them. We need to be sure that their families understand the importance of talk, and not just saying words, but saying complex sentences and talking in detail about things around them. You know, let's not just label, but let's discuss shoes. Let's discuss, what's in this bottle and what are the things you could put in the bottle, and who's going to drink from the bottle, and just general complex discussion that makes language interesting. Okay, any questions so far? Can we have a microphone down here?
¿Se me oye? ¿Sí?
Oh, momento.
Quería preguntar cómo aplica esto para niños bilingües o trilingües. En cuanto al número de palabras, ¿tiene que ser el número de palabras en un mismo idioma o vale con que sea la suma de los tres? Gracias.
Excellent question. It doesn't matter. I mean, it doesn't matter how many languages a child is exposed to. We need to just be sure that the child has a lot of language exposure. You don't need 14,000 words in each of your 3 languages. You need 14,000 words. And as long as the child's getting all those words, then the child will have the language stimulation that they need. Anything else? That was a good question. Thank you for asking. Okay, let's talk a little bit about literacy. There was a study in the United States in the Wall Street Journal which looked at the employment rates of adults who were not native English speakers. Now, this was a study in the United States, but it translates to wherever you are. What they discovered was that language proficiency was a very strong predictor of employment. People who were not proficient in English in the United States had very limited employment possibilities. They were primarily, the 5 top careers were building and grounds maintenance, production, construction, food preparation, and transportation, material moving things around. Things that required language were not possibilities for people who are not fluent English speakers. And we can use this information to think about children with hearing loss. They need to be fluent speakers in their native language, in the language in which they live. Because if they are not, the possibilities they have for what they can do as they get older is going to be limited. So it's just, one more piece in the puzzle of what we have to do for children with hearing loss. So children have to have a lot of different kinds of language. It's not just a simple list of vocabulary. They need language of technology, they need information and communication, they need media literacy, they need to know how to use the internet, they need to have health literacy, they need to know, all kinds of things about health and medical things around them. They need to have information, as much information as we can give them. They need to have critical thinking and problem solving, and they get that by having complex language, not just simple vocabulary. And they need to have communication and collaboration skills. They need to know how to work with somebody else using language to discuss what's possible and what we can do. So there's a lot of language skills that a child has to have in order for them to become literate in today's world. I'm having a little trouble with the slides there. Okay. So what do you have to do how do you get to the literacy skills? First, you have to hear the words. Again, technology, technology, technology. We have to get it, it has to be loud enough, and you have to hear it. Then you need to be able to listen to the words. You need to be able to notice them, to attend to them, to remember them. Then you need to understand what the words mean. And once you understand them, you have to start being able to use them. They have to become part of your vocabulary. Now, all of us understand more words than we use. That's just how life is. But you have to be able to understand a lot of words, and the number of words you use has to be complex. It has to be enough so that it can meet your needs as far as literacy is concerned. You need to recognize sound and symbol. You associate sounds with symbols. You need to know that the ta-ta-ta sound looks like that. We've been having this discussion with the clave people about the different phonemes, and I want to be sure I don't use a phoneme that's confusing here, because they've been trying to convince me that but and vus are the same ones, which they're not. They're not going to convince me of that. But if I say da-da-da, I want you to know that it looks like that. If I say ah, I want you to know that it looks like that. So those are the things that we want, that sound symbol association is critical. So we want phonemic awareness. We want them to recognize what those sounds are. And when you say ba 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 or ta 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 ta, I want them to know what that is and to be able to repeat it. I want them to start associating those things with words. When we're reading a book, if they recognize the T, I want them to look and say ta, 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 even if they don't know what the word is. I want them to be able to make that association with the phonemes that they know so that they can start to make the association. Once they make that association, then they're in a position of sounding out the words. But if they don't have phonemic awareness, if they don't recognize what the sound sounds like, then they're not able to sound out the words, which means that their literacy is going to be limited to sight recognition. That is very limiting. The number of words, if you only can read words you recognize, if you can't figure out what new words are, you're going to have very limited literacy skills. So once they recognize the sounds, they can start putting them together into words on their own. And we all know when children start to write, they spell things in a very funny way. But that's okay, because they're spelling them the way they sound to them, even though they're not necessarily the way you would write them if you were an adult and had the language. So here is a list of the number of words understood by typically developing children. A 2-year-old should understand about 300 words. A 5-year-old should understand about 2,500 words. A 7-year-old should understand about 20,000 words. And as with everything, what does this mean for our children with hearing loss? Well, one of the things it means is we better be sure that they're as close to that as we can make them. And how do we do that? By being sure we're providing auditory access so that they have both direct learning and incidental learning access. And then just working on language. But I think we need to keep those numbers in mind so we can think about what's possible. Reading aloud is not something we think about doing for children with hearing loss enough. Whenever a new baby is born and I have to send a baby present, I always send books. And I write a note to the baby saying, "Welcome, baby. Here are a bunch of books that I hope you will like. Tell your mama and your papa that they need to read 10 books a day to you." It might be rude for me to say to the parents, when I say that to a parent, they get insulted. But if I tell it to the baby, nobody gets insulted. Everybody thinks that's cute. I think we can't minimize how important books are. Exposure to storybooks turns out to be the biggest factor in preschoolers' vocabulary. The more we read to children, it's because we can talk about more things when we read a book. Books are not necessarily about things in everyday living. I mean, why did the 3 bears, do you have the 3 bears here? Why did the 3 bears, why were they eating the porridge? What's another word for porridge? And what happened to the porridge? What did the baby bear do? Why do you think the baby bear did that? Start using theory of mind to help figure out what was the baby bear thinking when the baby bear did, So whatever story you're talking about, you can have a discussion about it. And that's what builds children's vocabulary. When my littlest granddaughter was about 2, I went to take a book off the bookshelf to read to her, and in her room, for some reason, Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen was sitting on her bookshelf. I'm saying, what is this doing in this room? It happens to be my favorite book. So I took the book off the book, and I said, "Why is this here?" And this little 2-year-old said, "Nana, read it to me." And I'm thinking, there's no way that this kid could understand anything in this book. So I started reading it to her, and, I'm reading, and, I'm having a good time. It's a book I like. And then I said to her, "I think we should stop and read a different book." And she said, "No, Nana, I like it." Now, I know she didn't understand a lot of what was happening in this book, but she liked the sound of the language. She liked the rhythm. She liked the inflection. There were a lot of words she didn't know, and she certainly didn't get the concepts. a man of good fortune is looking for a wife. What could that mean to a 2-year-old? But the point is that just by exposing her to that language, she got something, she liked, there was something about it that she liked. I did stop and read a children's book, even though I would have much more enjoyed Pride and Prejudice. But the point is that the more language, we can expose kids to an enormous amount of language by reading. There are lots of more conversations that happen about things when you're going through books than through other things. So books are critical. Children who receive read-alouds have twice as many words in their vocabulary as children who do not have read-alouds. And we think about reading aloud as a conversation. By the time a child is around 4, we should start reading chapter books. We can read a chapter or 2 at night, and then tomorrow night, before you go to bed, we'll read the next couple of chapters. And it's also important to remember to continue to read to children, and this is all children, even after they can read for themselves, because the books we can read to them are more complex, first of all, so they'll have exposure to more complex language. But it'll also give you an opportunity to discuss the books, because you can talk about what's in the language. That's more interesting. Another factor, the research shows that 90% of read-alouds are conducted by mothers, and only 10% are conducted by fathers. First of all, who is surprised? But it's not a good thing, because the discussions that mothers and fathers will have about the books will probably be different. So it's important that fathers do read-alouds to their children also. So it's an important intervention that we can offer. And my friend Carol Flexer, who I write my textbooks with, Carol says that that she thinks every audiology report, when you're describing how a child is hearing, at the end of the report you should write that you need to read aloud 10 books to preschool children every day, and to older children you need to read aloud for at least 45 minutes. It's not normally thought of as an audiology recommendation, but I think it is not a bad one. And I certainly include it in every language evaluation that I do. And it's important when you're reading aloud to select classic literature and select things that children, that give you the kind of knowledge that it helps to be exposed to. Use synonyms in conversation. Use words that you don't necessarily use. Use different words. What's another word for this? What's another word for porridge? What's another word for considering? So kids have the opportunity to think about different things. Discuss how the books make you feel. Is this making you sad? This story is making me very sad. I mean, you're reading Cinderella. I mean, what happened? Why do you think that the stepmother did what she did? What was she thinking? What do you think she was feeling? And helping kids develop, first of all, teaches them empathy, teaches them sympathy, teaches them to recognize emotions, and teaches them language, all of which are critical. And then, after you've discussed part of the book, have the child tell the story back to you. Because one of the things we're working on building is auditory memory. We want to know that a child's got the skills, has auditory memory, because auditory memory is critical for learning. Music is also critical for learning. The brain loves music, right brain activity over here, and music, if the music you're listening to has words, it exercises the whole brain, because the words are on this side and the music is on this side. Sing to children, sing songs, make up a song about anything you are doing. I'm washing the dishes, the dishes, the dishes. I'm washing the dishes, ho, ho, ho. Now I'm adding soap, soap, soap. Now, it's just whatever. I mean, it doesn't have to be a real song, and you don't have to have a gorgeous voice. But by providing music, you're sort of building skills, and all of that is important. Make up songs, play musical instruments. We can bang pots together, use sticks, whatever. But you just want to provide as much music exposure as you can, as early as you can. Okay. let's move on here to technology. In order for children to do well, to build this auditory brain, they have to have appropriate technology that is acoustically, with good acoustic accessibility. They have to have enriched auditory exposure, and that will develop the auditory brain. If a child does not have appropriately fit technology, it doesn't matter how much auditory exposure they have, they won't have an auditory brain development. If they have the best possible technology and no one is talking to them, they will not have good auditory brain development. They need technology and exposure in order to have the kind of auditory brain development that children need. So what does it take for a child with a hearing loss to succeed? We plan for a child depending on what the family's goal is. The family guides us. The family's desires guide us. They require, both ethically and legally, a family's desires for their child guide us. So when I meet a family, I say to the family, and I probably say this over the years to each family, what is your goal for your child? Where do you want your child to be when they're 5, when they're 10, when they're 15, when they're 20? And I've spoken to an awful lot of families in 50 years. And I have never had a family say, I want my child to have limited language skills and limited reading skills and be unemployable in their life. Families' goals for their child with hearing loss are almost always the same as their goals for their typical hearing children. Parents say, I want him to go to school with his brothers. I want him to be whatever he wants to be when he grows up. And that's what our goal is. That's every parent's goal for every child. We need to ask families what their goal is, and then we say to them, let's talk about what it takes to get to that goal. The parent has set the goal, and we then have to decide, have to help them get to the goal. That's our responsibility. 95% of children with hearing loss are born to hearing parents. So their goal is to have their child fit into their world, which has hearing people in it. So their language is spoken language, and their goal is usually spoken language. So for a child to succeed, they have to have language at age level, they have to have literacy at age level, and they have to have social emotional skills at age level. That's what they need in order to succeed. And what does it take to get to that? First, you need early identification, and you have newborn hearing screening in this country, so those babies are going to get identified at birth. Then they need aggressive audiological management. They need to hear very well with their technology, because that's the only way we're going to build the brain and give them language. They need to wear the technology full time. If a child wears hearing aids 4 hours a day, it will take him 6 years to hear what a typical child hears in 1 year. I want to say that again because I think it's very important. If a child wears hearing aids 4 hours a day, it will take him 6 years to hear what a typical child hears in 1 year. So when I'm working with a family, if the family is having trouble getting the child to wear hearing aids, I say that to the parents. And let me tell you, it's a very scary thing to say, because they get the message that if this child is only, if it's going to take this kid 6 years to learn every 1 year's worth of activity, where is this child going to be at 18? So I think it's an important piece of it. I find it helpful in helping parents understand why you need technology on every waking minute, and it has to work. They need to be listening in an environment that's acoustically accessible so that they can hear the speech both normal conversation and soft speech from the outside. They need to have family support. They need to have therapy that is auditory based to help the child build auditory skills, and the parents know how to help the child build auditory skills. And that's listening and spoken language, auditory verbal practice. They need a language-rich environment. They need people to be talking to them in complex language, in reading complex books, and in helping them think in a complex way. They need a lot of opportunities to learn. They need to be exposed to things. They need to go to the museum. They need to go to the park. They need to go places where someone's going to talk to them about the things around them. And they need to be in an educational program that's willing to make some adaptations. They need to be in a preschool that's going to turn off the music that's in a background, which I have a hard time understanding why anybody thinks that's a good idea. But for a child, when there's a child with a hearing loss in the room, they don't need background music. So the child has to have auditory brain access. Have I said that enough times so far today? They need to have access to language stimulation, and they need to have access to instructional information. Those are the things they need. So let's talk about early identification for a minute. We have newborn hearing screening. In the United States, and also in Spain, I understand, the goal is that the child be identified by 1 month, technology by 3 months, therapy by 6 months. Don't ask me why the therapy should wait. I personally believe you should start the therapy in the hospital before, immediately, because parents need to learn how to provide language. I will tell you that in the United States, the Joint Commission requirements are about to be changed, so it's diagnosis by 1 month, technology by 2 months, and therapy by 3 months. So instead of 1, 3, 6, we are moving to 1, 2, 3. And I'm very excited about that, because it means less time that a child will be without hearing. And why is it important? Auditory brain development and language stimulation. Okay, so what really happens? These slides had a lot of information in them, and then when we added the Spanish translation, it became almost impossible to read them. So I hope you can read them. But so babies are referred after newborn hearing screening, but they don't always get to where they need to get to in a quick enough time. There are not enough pediatric audiologists. They have to travel for the appointment. The appointments are too far away. There's not enough personnel. They can't afford to pay for technology. So there's a million reasons why it doesn't happen early enough. But whatever they are, they're not excusable, and we need to figure out how to solve the problems, because we know all the research is very clear about the amount of time we have to waste, which is none. We need to get technology on babies early. We need to know that it works, and we need to be sure that we're getting them the services that they need. So, there are delays in appointments. The kid gets sick. They don't show up. They're late for the appointment because the bus was late, and then the next kid's there. There's a million reasons why it doesn't work. We need to try to figure out how to get over those, because we need to get the children to hear. So, how well do they need to hear? Well, they need to hear as well as a typical hearing child hears, because that's how much language they need to have. They need to hear normal conversation. They need to hear soft conversation, because they need to be able to overhear conversation around them if they're going to learn. And they need to be able to hear when there's competing noise, because that's how the world is. Unfortunately, the world is not quiet. So we need to hear in all of those things. And we've talked about the types of auditory problems that interfere with learning: hearing loss, auditory processing, auditory attention disorders, or children who have sound sensitivities. All of those are going to affect the way a child learns. So let's talk for a minute about what is normal hearing, because I think this is an important concept. Children who have normal hearing hear between 0 and 15 decibels at all the frequencies, from low pitch to high pitch. Children with normal hearing have speech perception at normal conversation, soft conversation, and in competing noise at 90% to 100%. even 3-year-olds can hear well in competing noise. They have auditory processing skills between 90 and 100% when the signal is not clear. They can manage to follow a conversation. They don't want to do it for a long period of time, but they're capable of managing if they have to. Normal hearing children don't have, at the time a child has normal hearing, they don't have middle ear disease, no ear infections. So those are the things you have to have in order to have normal hearing. The kids we're worried about obviously don't have that. Degree of hearing loss is certainly a factor. Mild hearing loss, as I've said earlier, is not mild, and it's not a mild problem, and we need to recognize it as interfering with learning. And then you may have a conductive hearing loss, which hopefully is temporary unless it's structural, or a sensory neural hearing loss, which is permanent, or a mixed hearing loss. And some children will have, it'll be a sensory neural hearing loss, which gets a conductive overlay every time they get an ear infection. Now, if you have normal hearing and you get an ear infection and it interferes how you're learning in the classroom, and if you start off with a hearing loss and then you land an ear infection on top of it, you're going to really have a hard time hearing in the classroom. So we need to pay attention to that. So what does intelligible speech look like? What is our goal? Every speech sound needs to be audible, not just the Ling 6 sounds. You need to hear every single phoneme. You need to hear at normal and soft conversation. You need to hear close up and at a distance. You need to hear in quiet and in noise. And you need to be able to overhear. Those are all critical things in order for you to have intelligible speech, the speech you receive to be intelligible. What do we have to do to make it work? We have to identify them early. We have to get that technology on them. And we have to make sure that they're wearing it every waking hour. We have to make sure it's appropriately fit and that they're getting good auditory learning with it. And I'm going to talk about appropriately fit in a couple of minutes because it's critical. They need to have a lot of auditory stimulation. They need to be able to hear soft speech. And they need to have auditory therapy with family involvement if these kids are going to succeed. I like this slide because I spent a lot of time making it. The child is in the middle, most important person here, and those are all of the people involved with working with this child. The immediate family, but the extended family critical, the audiologist, and if there may be an audiologist in the school, the physicians, the speech language pathologist or listening and spoken language specialist who works with the child in the center or outside, a social worker and psychologist, teachers, general education teachers, teachers of the deaf, spoken language specialists in the schools are all people involved in making these children successful. So what do they need to hear? The majority of information that children learn at home and in school, they learn using audition, and they learn by overhearing. They need to hear their parents and their siblings, whether they're standing next to them or moving away. They need to hear their classroom teacher. They need to hear other children's comments. They need to hear their own voice. They need to be able to hear what other children are saying, and they need to hear what they are saying so they can correct their pronunciation and make sure that they are being clear. They need to hear classroom discussion. They need not just what's the final answer, but they need to hear all of the discussion involved in what someone was thinking, what did that mean, what's going on. They need to hear in the cafeteria, which is very noisy, high ceilings, hard walls, terrible acoustics. They need to hear in the auditorium when the teacher is talking, when the principal is talking, when whatever is being said in the auditorium is being said. We need to know for sure that they can hear those things. They need to be able to follow the computers. They need to be able to, if they're showing a movie in school, we need to know that they've connected into the movie projector so that the child with hearing loss is following what's happening. Hearing is a complex function. It's not safe to assume that because a child has a hearing aid on, that we know they're capable of hearing. We don't know that they've heard what they need to hear. They may respond to some sounds and not to others, and unless we have tested, we don't know. Never assume. Children may hear in quiet, not hear in noise, or not hear at distance. If we haven't tested, we don't know. If they don't know, their language will be delayed, their academics will be delayed, and once they start to get delayed, it's very hard to catch up. Their reading skills will be delayed, and their social skills will be delayed. And once that happens, there's a lot of social emotional issues once a child's got social skill problems. So the world is auditory. Language is learned by listening. Incidental learning is critical, and language is critical for reading. So we need to know that children have access to language first. We also need to know that speech is audible. I am sorry this slide did not get translated, but I'm going to say it slowly because I want you to understand it. Audibility is how much is heard. Intelligibility is how much is understood. Audibility is primarily carried by the vowels. Vowels are stronger. They have more emphasis than consonants. So vowels have much of the audibility of speech, but only 10% of the intelligibility. Consonants have 90% of the intelligibility and only 10% of the audibility. The problem with this is that consonants carry the most important information for understanding language. They're very soft. So but they carry all the important information. So again, we need to be sure that technology is doing what it needs to do. The high frequencies, which is where the critical consonant information is where we have our problem. So classrooms are noisy environments. Academic learning relies on hearing. If auditory function isn't adequate, a child will not learn language and will be delayed in every aspect of the things that they need to do academically. We've talked about this. Hearing in a noisy place is a problem. I had a little guy he's in junior high school, and all of his friends used to hang out in the parking lot of McDonald's after school. And as soon as it got dark, and he couldn't rely on lip reading anymore, he went home. And then he got a second cochlear implant, and all of a sudden he could hear without looking. And after he had this implant for about a month, he came in for an evaluation, and I said to the mom, how's it going? And she said, well, he got punished for the first time. And I said, what happened? And she said, he didn't come home after it got dark. And I said, I sort of sat there for a minute, and I said, you do know that it's a good thing that he could hear in the dark? And she said, I know it's a good thing, but he was supposed to be home as soon as it got dark, and he didn't get home, so he got punished. And I thought, I don't care that he can, that he didn't get home. I just am so excited that he heard in the dark that he could hang around in the McDonald's parking lot. But, so it's, how much they hear, and hearing and noise has such social implications that we shouldn't ignore it. They need to get the language. They need to get the slang and the idioms. They need to get sarcasm. And sarcasm is almost exclusively auditory. They need to get jokes. They need to get annoyance, which is, you may see some annoyance on a person's face, but a lot of it is in the tone of voice. And we want kids to hear well enough to be able to do that. So we've talked about all of this, I think. The things that affect auditory learning: hearing, access to auditory information, the amount of auditory deprivation a child has had, good and constant language modeling, controlling the noise, and their sound sensitivities. All of those are things that affect auditory learning. If you have problems with auditory learning, this is what happens. Children who have inconsistent responses to sound, who hear some of it or don't hear others of it, children who are not hearing well in the high frequencies, who are missing sibilants and fricatives, are going to have a problem with language. Children who have difficulties in response timing because they're not hearing well enough to get the timing of speech. Children who have a short attention span for auditory stimuli, who can't tune in, who don't have auditory memory, children who are distracted. But there's a child who's working on their homework and a car goes by outside and child A can ignore it and child B has to look up and see what's going on with that car. That child's going to have a harder time because they can't concentrate enough. Children who have difficulty with phonics, difficulty remembering things that are learned auditorily, difficulty localizing where the sound is coming from, all of that is going to affect auditory learning. And again, it's all about the brain. Hearing loss is not about the ears, it's about the brain. All the technology is only about providing access to the brain so that children can so that we have brain access tools, they can build the skills in their brain. And the audiologist is the person who is critical in doing this. It's the audiologist who has to make the technology work, who has to be sure the child is hearing at the top of the speech banana. Muddy in, muddy out. If you do not get clear information in, you don't get clear information out of the child's mouth. Dan Ling used to say, what they hear is what they say. One of my first jobs as an audiologist was at an auditory verbal center in New York City, in which the person who was the director used to make us, we would talk to the child before we did the evaluation, and she would make us draw the audiogram from listening to the child's speech. That was one of the best skills I've developed as a clinician, because I can listen to a person's speech and I know I can almost change the hearing aid settings just by listening to them talk. I don't normally do that. I go into the test booth and make sure I'm right. But by listening, if a child is not producing S, it's because they're not hearing S. If a child is not producing B, it's because they're not hearing B. Occasionally there's something structural wrong, but 98% of the time, what they hear is what they say. And if they're not hearing it, if they're not saying it, it's because they're not hearing it. So they're not going to get it, they're not going to learn new information, and they're going to have trouble in classrooms because classrooms are auditory situations. So we talked about this, audibility, already. And we talked about this. So what are our solutions? We want to reduce the noise in a classroom. In homes, we want to turn off the television, we want to turn off the dishwasher, we want to turn off the washing machine while we're trying to have a conversation, because we want to provide as much auditory access as we can. We want to cut the reverberation, we want to put acoustic tiles on the ceiling, we want to drop the ceiling if we can, and we want to provide as much sound. We want the sound to be as clear and as quiet as possible. We want to reduce, in a classroom, we want to reduce student-generated noise. We want to put tennis balls on the bottom of the chairs and the tables so that when they move around, that we're not listening to all the kinds of noise that children make. We can't get rid of the children, who are the majority of the noise, but we can get rid of the other noise around them. And we want to make sure that the signal-to-noise ratio is as good as possible. I'm getting tangled somehow over here. Well, we'll see. So what frequencies do children need to hear? Now, these are English formats. I understand you only have 5 vowels in Spanish. You're lucky. We have a lot more. But the problem is exactly the same. Let's look at the frequencies of the vowels. Now, you do have E, and E is the only vowel in which there's a high frequency sound. The rest of them are all low frequency. And remember, we said earlier that low frequency sounds are, that vowels are low frequency, which is more audible but less intelligible. 90% audibility, 10% of the intelligibility. But here are the consonants. Now, they're not, Spanish consonants are not exactly the same as English consonants, and Clave and I've been talking with Carmen, and we're going to talk about a way to get the Spanish consonants, to get some research done here. But basically, what I want to point out to you is look over here. Look at how many consonants, more than half, have energy at 4,000 hertz and above. What does that mean for children with hearing loss? It means you better be sure that their technology is providing them access at 4,000 hertz and above. Because if not, then how are they going to learn language? So let's talk a little bit about speech intelligibility. So the goal of technology is to understand speech. That's why we put technology on children. So, how do we know what they're doing? Only by testing, by doing an evaluation and understanding how they understand speech. So, what's the goal of the evaluation? If the goal is to obtain the best possible score, you should use a very easy test so that you can score them very high. But if the goal is to see how they compare with their typical hearing peers, how they are doing with their technology, how they manage in the classroom, we need to be using the same tests we would use for their typical hearing peers. Because otherwise, we're not identifying what we can fix. And the goal of this is to see what's wrong and know what we can fix. So, children need to hear high frequencies. Hearing at 6,000 and 8,000 hertz is critical. Why? Because there are phonemes there that carry important information. That means we need to be sure their technology is providing information at 6,000 and 8,000 hertz. If they're missing that information, they're going to miss significant grammatical markers like pluralization and possession, grammatical markers that are critical for understanding a language. They need to also hear at a soft enough level. We need to test their speech perception at soft speech so we know whether they're capable of incidental learning, of overhearing around them, of hearing at a distance. And we need to test their ability to hear in noise because the world is a noisy place. And if they're not hearing in noise, we have to do something about it. We have to make sure they have an FM system that they can wear all the time, that they can use to learn language in noisy situations. So if we don't test in those situations, we don't know. So every sound needs to be audible. And speech perception is more than the Ling sounds, as I said before. And they need to hear at typical and at soft levels. 90% of what they learn, but they learn incidentally. We need to know they can hear soft speech to do that. So this is the audiology fruit, also known as the speech banana. If you hear at the B line over here, you will hear 90% of what is said. If you hear at the C line down here, you will only hear 10% of what is said. If you hear at the A line, you will hear about 50% of what is said. So where do you want this child that you care about with a hearing loss to hear? You better be hearing at the B line, otherwise this child's missing too much. So here is a Count the Dots audiogram, which is a counseling tool that was made by Gus Mueller and Meade Killian a number of years back. There are 100 dots here in the speech banana. You will see that more information is in the highs than in the lows, more dots. And this is only a counseling tool. It's not intended as a substitute for a good speech perception test. But here is this person who's hearing, the circles are the person's hearing in their right ear. So what they're hearing are the sounds that are louder than their hearing loss. And there are 57 dots over here, 55 dots. You can count them if you want, but trust me. Okay, so their unaided hearing, they're going to get about 55% of the words. With hearing aids on, they're only missing those 3 dots over there, so they're going to understand about 97% of the words. But here is the speech banana, and it's got the phonemes on it. So you can see that the phoneme has energy over here, it has energy over here, it has energy over here. And n has energy here, it has energy there. Both of those are in the same place. But when we get over here, n is in a different place. So if a child is confusing and n, I'm going to say something is wrong in this area. Because that in the high frequencies, that's where the energy in that area is where this child is missing information. So I'm suggesting that since we know the child needs to hear at the top of the banana, that we think about it as the string bean. I want the child to hear at the string bean. And if you don't like string beans, you can make it asparagus. Or if you want, you could make it carrots. But you have to change the color. And it took me a long time to find string beans to put in there, so. But our goal, my goal when I'm working with a child with a hearing loss, is to have their aided thresholds at the string bean. Right ear at the string bean, left ear at the string bean. Because if they're not hearing at the string bean, let's remember, if they're hearing over here, they're only getting 50%. If they're hearing over here, they're only getting 10%. The kid I care about, I want them to hear at the string bean. Any questions? Either I'm being very clear or I'm so muddy that you can't, okay. So here's something that I think I want you to think about. Here is the string bean. That's my goal for where I want aided thresholds to be. Normal conversation is at around 50 decibels over here. If a child's hearing at the string bean, they're hearing loud enough at 50 decibels, so they're going to have an easy time with normal conversation. Here is soft speech at 35 decibels. They're going to hear well enough. It's not as easy as normal conversation, but they're going to hear well enough if they're hearing at the string bean. But let's think about this. If a child has aided thresholds at 30 decibels, how is that going to affect what they hear? Are they going to hear soft speech? One person shook their head no. Nobody else. Somebody went metza metza. Nobody else is doing anything. Okay, how many people think if you have aided thresholds at 30 decibels, you will comfortably hear soft speech? You won't. Because if you're hearing right over here, soft speech is going to be so soft that there is no way you're going to be able to follow the conversation. Normal conversation will sound like this, which is still a lot of work to listen to all day long. It won't be its normal, loud enough, but it'll be enough so that you could manage in quiet. But soft speech you're not going to get. So what does this mean for monitoring technology on children with hearing loss? What it means to me is that I better know that they are hearing at the string bean. Questions? Oh, microphone over there, please.
Una pregunta.
Oh, wait, I'm not hearing you. Oh, okay. Never mind. Go ahead.
Cuando se programan implantes cocleares, siempre tenemos un problema porque subir los umbrales nos indica que, por ejemplo, en los graves, que, bueno, siempre nos dicen los programadores que se está escuchando mucho ruido de fondo, que el micrófono, y nos toca dejar los umbrales en 25-30 decibelios. Yo siempre me he peleado con ello. He visto programaciones, de hecho vi una charla suya de Fernanda Hinojosa con Joan Hiwi, donde hablaba de los umbrales y de qué se podía hacer. En su experiencia, eso realmente es una especie de mito que no se pueden subir esos umbrales, sobre todo en los graves, o sí se puede lograr que un niño con implante coclear llegue a mejorar esos umbrales en graves y a reconocer, identificar y que el ruido no moleste allí.
Thank you for asking that question, because this is a topic I am, that makes me crazy. So I thank you for asking this. First of all, let me say I am less worried about the low frequencies because there's not a lot of information that's carried in the vowels. I am most interested in the mid frequencies and the high frequencies. That is where it's critical that a child hear. So I want a child to have good hearing in the mid frequencies and the high frequencies. I am willing to accept 25 for a cochlear implant, not for hearing aid, because the way they process speech is different, but not more than 25, because a child will not have good access if they are hearing it louder than 25. I'm not worried about the low frequencies. The low frequencies can be at 30 because there's not that much information carried in the low frequencies. And if you have too much in the low frequencies, you have two problems. You will have some upward spread of masking, which may distort the high frequencies, and you will also have too much noise. But the mid frequencies and the high frequencies are where we have intelligibility, and that is the part that's critical. Does that answer your question? Question over here.
Yo quería saber si estos umbrales son igualmente importantes para un niño ya más mayor, con el lenguaje perfectamente adquirido, perfectamente con un desarrollo curricular bueno y un desarrollo académico bueno también. Me gustaría saber si es igualmente importante para este tipo de niños. Estoy hablando en concreto de mi hija, que tiene 10 años.
Is your 10-year-old child still learning?
Sí.
So what is the answer to the question? As long as your child is learning, they have to have access to good. I mean, as an adult, I have a hearing loss. Took me a long time to get my hearing aids adjusted so that I could hear. I'm very excited that I can now hear in a noisy restaurant. For me, that's a big deal. I'm not learning language. A little language I'm learning. I'm not learning academics, but it's still important for me to be able to communicate with the people around me. So yes, there is no age at which you don't need to hear well. No age. Any other questions?
Ha especificado que 30 decibelios es admisible para implante coclear. ¿Cuál es el umbral en el que debería estar?
No.
Sorry.
No. 25 is the limit. That's a difference.
Yes, you're right. ¿Cuál sería para audífonos? Una pérdida moderada severa. ¿Cuál sería el umbral razonable para audífonos?
20 decibels is the limit. No worse than 20 for hearing aids, no worse than 25 for cochlear implants. That is my goal. I know the manufacturers argue with me about that, but, too bad. I've been doing I know what a kid needs to hear. And can I have my slide back, please? If you look over here, think about what kind of access a child will have to soft speech. If you believe soft speech is important, if you believe incidental learning is important, then you need to know absolutely that a child has access to soft speech. The difference between what a child can learn if they have access to soft speech and what they cannot learn if they don't have access to soft speech is very dramatic in who they will be as an adult. In all frequencies, at least from 1,000 up, from 1,000 through 8,000, or at the limit through 6,000. And let me say something else. I said this yesterday to the staff at Clave. When I test a child with hearing aids, I know a lot of hearing aids don't provide information at 6,000 and 8,000 hertz. That's a problem. When I test a child, I still test them at 6,000 and 8,000 hertz because I think we all need to know what they're missing. And only if we can't assume. We have to test in order to know. And they need to hear high frequencies. It's what time? And we're ending at 3 or at? I'm not even close to being finished. Oh well. Any other questions?
Sí. Una pregunta. ¿Se oye? Sí, yo quería consultarle porque cada vez vemos con más frecuencia pues niños implantados con una tecnología maravillosa que llegan a obtener una audiometría con una funcionalidad auditiva como la judía verde, es decir, que oyen el césped moverse casi, pero no procesan el lenguaje. Es decir, no comprenden el lenguaje. Entonces, el otro día había un caso que me dejaba impactada y era el caso de un niño con un implante precoz y con una familia que había estado yendo a estimulación del lenguaje casi diariamente. Después de 10 años ya ven que el niño no desarrolla la lengua oral, el niño no procesaba la lengua oral. Entonces mi pregunta es, ¿cuál sería su consejo, ¿no?, para estos casos que cada vez tenemos más? Tenemos muchos niños que van muy bien, pero tenemos muchos niños que no van bien a pesar de esta tecnología maravillosa. Entonces, ¿cuánto tiempo, lo digo de cara a los logopedas que sean jóvenes aquí, ¿no? ¿Cuánto tiempo tengo que estar trabajando esta audición insistentemente? Porque el padre lloraba y decía, mi hijo no tiene flores.
I understand the question. I understand the question, and it's a big problem. But let me say two things here. Thing number one is I want to see the test results before I can answer a question for a child. I want to know what their aided thresholds in the right ear are and what the aided thresholds in the left ear are. Because, you know, when someone says he hears wonderfully, I don't believe it until I see it. I want to know what the aided thresholds are, and I want to know what the child's speech perception is at normal and soft conversation and quiet at least. A child may have good access, but there's distortion. If the implant is set so that there's distortion in the implant, they're like this, they're not going to develop speech and language. I had a family consult me who had a child who was, at the time they spoke to me, they called me, he was 2 years old. He had been bilaterally implanted at 6 months of age. And he was 24 months, and so for 18 months he had been listening with 2 cochlear implants. And the first thing I always say to a parent is, what does he hear with his technology? And the mother said to me, I don't know. Red flag. I said to the therapist who was working with him, what does he hear with his technology? And she said, I don't know. Then I wanted to take her certification away because it's her job to know. Then I said to the audiologist, what does he hear with his technology? And she said, I don't know. I don't think he's ready to learn. Well, I don't know what that means, but I have never heard of a child who wasn't ready to learn. I mean, that's not a concept. No child is not ready to learn. It's our job to make them interested enough. So I put I sent the child to the audiologist to test the child, and the child had aided thresholds at -5. So there was so much distortion in the system that he could not understand any speech. We remapped the cochlear implant, so he was hearing at 15 to 20, and in 3 months he was talking in 2 to 3 word sentences. Now, I'm not saying that that every child will be a success, but I actually believe that almost every child will be a success. I want to know what exactly the child is hearing, because if I know what the child is hearing, I can help figure out what the problem is. If I don't know, and it's not enough to say he's hearing the grass. I need to know what his aided thresholds are. I need to know what speech perception is at normal and soft conversation. And then we can figure out what has to happen. If a child cannot learn, yes, the child needs, we need to think about other ways of teaching the child. But first, let's figure out whether the audiology is the problem, because 90% of the time, it's the audiology that's the problem. Does that answer your question? A little.
Bueno, en este caso yo creo que estaba muy estudiado por muchos audiólogos y era un caso de dificultad en el procesamiento del lenguaje. Entonces mi pregunta era en cuánto tiempo se recomienda pues tomar una decisión en otro sentido, ¿no? En el sentido de otro tipo de lenguaje como la lengua de signos.
I would start off by something like cued speech rather than sign language, which allows the child to have, to have easier communication with the world around him. But if the child's not learning, then you have to go to whatever you have to go to. But the parents then have to learn sign language. Everybody in the child's environment needs to learn sign language, and you need to find an educational program that's going to work that. But if a child has a language processing disorder in spoken language, there is no reason to believe that the child will not also have a language disorder in sign language. It is still a language disorder, and it won't get better from using sign language. We need to solve the language problem. Another question. Okay, let's see how many more slides we can get through in 10 minutes, and then, well, there's a question over here. It might be more useful to just answer questions at this point.
Bueno, yo quería...
Yep.
Sí. Quería preguntarte tu experiencia sobre los audífonos que no llegan a amplificar esas frecuencias entre 4.000 y 10.000 hercios o 6.000 hercios. Si te parece bien el utilizar la transposición frecuencial.
The answer to that is it depends. It depends. Frequency transposition works well in certain situations, but it is not a substitute because you end up with a compressed signal that distorts. So yes, it is good, but if a child really needs frequency transposition, I think we should think about whether they would be better off with a cochlear implant. They will get a cleaner signal with a cochlear implant than they will get with frequency transposition.
Okay, gracias.
Welcome. Anything else? Okay, let's see where we can go here. Let's talk about this, and then maybe we will be done. I mean, I have another, I think 20 slides, so we're not going to get there. I think this is important. I think when we describe speech perception skills, we need to describe them honestly. If I have a child who's got a 64% speech perception score, and I say speech perception is good, what message am I giving to the child, to the parent, to the therapist, to the teacher? The message I'm giving, if I say a child has good speech perception, is that there's nothing else that has to happen, that the child doesn't have anything else we don't have to do any more therapy, we don't have to fix it. When 64% is terrible speech perception. So we need to be honest, and we need to score children with hearing loss the same way we score children who have normal hearing. Excellent speech perception is 90 to 100%. Good speech perception is 80 to 89%. Fair speech perception is 70 to 79%. And poor speech perception is less than 70%. If a child has 64% speech perception, I need to say speech perception is poor. Because the message I am giving to everybody is, we have work to do to fix this. I may say a child's speech perception in his right ear at normal conversation is excellent. In his left ear, it's good. At soft conversation, his speech perception is good. In noise, speech perception is fair. So I want to describe, as you know, when I'm testing, I think, is that the next one? I don't know, there's a slide. When I'm doing speech perception testing, I want to test right ear, left ear, both ears together. Because there are some children for whom I may have excellent speech perception. I have a child who has 88% speech perception in one ear and 56% in the other ear. And then when I put the two ears together, they have 72%. Because the poorer ear is just causing distortion and bringing down the perception in the better ear. Do you understand what I'm saying? Or you could have a child who has, you know, the 88% in one ear and 56% in the other ear. But if I only test binaurally with the two ears together and I get 88%, I don't even know something's wrong with the other ear. So then I don't know, I have to either fix the hearing aid or work on therapy or do both in the poorer hearing ear. So if I don't test each ear separately, when we're working with children, when we are figuring out what we have to do for children, we have to look at each ear separately and two ears together. That is the only way we know what is going on and we can plan remediation for each ear. If we don't do that, we don't know. Does that make sense? And it's critical. And I travel around the world doing this kind of talking, and I'm stunned, both in the United States and outside, at how people don't test each ear separately. It's not magic. We have to know what's happening in each ear. You can't assume that the two ears together are telling you the same thing. How many children walk into the clinic and don't even know they have a broken hearing aid because they're relying on the better hearing ear? Not a good situation. Okay, we've run out of time. I apologize. Questions? Let's have a few ending questions, and then if you have specific questions for me, I'm happy to answer them. Nobody has any more questions? Well, thank you very much. It's been wonderful.
Gracias a la doctora Jill Madell, gracias a todos. Por favor, complementar la encuesta que está se entregó al inicio y lo agradeceríamos muchísimo. También informamos que estamos recogiendo información sobre el modelo centrado en la familia, en concreto sobre dos de los principios relacionados con la toma de decisiones y el establecimiento de redes, que por favor lo divulgamos a través de nuestras redes sociales, que pidáis a las familias que colaboren. Os lo agradeceríamos muchísimo. Gracias.